Well, you ready to move on? Should we introduce Stephen Rodriguez? Or
Let's absolutely do that.
Okay, good. Well, our next gentleman we're going to bring on board, Stephen is the founder of One Defense. This is an agile network of market-leading non-traditional technology companies, venture capital firms, and research universities dedicated to scouting advanced software and hardware applications, and thus enabling their transition into the national security enterprise. Concurrently, he has served as a venture partner supporting the above market venture portfolio performance of Sine Wave Ventures, Scout Ventures, and Abundance Partners. Rodriguez began his career at Booz Allen Hamilton shortly before 9/11, so just over 20 years ago, supporting their national security practice. In his capacity as an expert on game theoretic applications, he supported the United States intelligence community and Department of Defense as the lead architect for the Thor's Hammer, Schreiber 2 and 3, and Cyber Storm war games. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Laura, a venture capitalist with Bulldog Innovation Group, and their children, Fletcher and Violet. So, Stephen Rodriguez, delighted to have you on board today. Thanks so much for being a part of this. Good morning.
It's great to be here, and greetings from Cincinnati, where I'm in a hotel room for, speaking of venture capital, our annual investor meeting. So it's important when you ask people for money that you then dutifully report on what you did with the money. So
they like that.
Generally a good idea. Thank you very much for joining me, and I'd like to welcome our panelists to turn on their video as well, Steve, Kimberly, and Dimitri. This is a timely topic. Just 2 days ago, the Department of Defense confirmed that indeed great power competition is no longer the term of art. Now we are going with simply strategic competition with China, Russia, and others like them. And it's a timely panel, I think, to kick off and set the tone for what we're going to spend the rest of today discussing, simply because if you don't set the strategic context, then what are you really talking about to begin with? Dual use technology, innovation, these are fashionable terms, even inside Capitol Hill and the Pentagon. And yet when discussed without the context of a broader security dynamic, now known as strategic competition, it's a bit of hot air, if I can say so. So I thought it would be a great discussion, not just to have a bunch of senior officials from a certain department or a bunch of congressmen or senators from the Hill, but to have a panel with 3 people I know personally, which is convenient, as well as people coming from different perspectives across the United States government. So we have Steve Cambone. He's currently the Associate Vice Chancellor for Cybersecurity at Texas A&M. He was one of my favorite roles in DoD. He was the director of CAPE before becoming the first Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence under the Bush administration. He has since led several aerospace and defense corporations before assuming his current role. Kimberly Reed was immediately prior the outgoing, let's see if I get all these right, this chairman, CEO, and I think that's all the roles, president at the Export-Import Bank, and oversaw a landmark 7-year expansion of the bank's charter. She has also been an official and appointee with the Department of Treasury, as well as a senior staffer on Capitol Hill. And of course, Dimitri Kusnezov, he has just departed as the Deputy Undersecretary of Energy for Artificial Intelligence and Technology, which is a fantastic title, and has had a career at DOE as well as the National Nuclear Safety and Security Administration, NNSA, correct, Dimitri?
That's right.
Great. So introductions out of the way, what we'll do is we'll have a couple remarks from our panelists, Steve, Kimberly, and then Dimitri. 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll get into a discussion where at a certain point we'll be able to pull the rest of the audience in. So with those out of the way, Steve, obviously from your position now as a senior official within a large state organization, covering cybersecurity as well as industrial policy and industrial security. Would love to hear your thoughts from having spent a lifetime of public service in the Pentagon, in the aerospace and defense industry, and of course now in academia. Over to you, Steve. I think you're on mute. Sorry.
Good morning, Steve. Good morning, Kim, Dimitri, and folks online. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. So let me begin with a thought on the great power competition point. Whether we call it a strategic competition or a great power competition is probably not too terribly important for the moment. It's worth noting that the Chinese have talked about engaging in a new type great power relationship with the United States at least since 2010, 2011. President Xi raised the prospect with President Obama in 2013 when they met out in the desert in California. And from the Chinese point of view, it was meant to tell the United States and the world that China intended to compete, to vie for, to attempt to take leadership of the direction of the international community. It was a claim that as time went on, the world would have to begin to take into account China's interests when others made decisions about their own interests. And that was particularly true of the United States. The Chinese have not let up on that theme, and they continue to insist on that deference, if you will. And we can see it lately in their behavior, particularly with respect, for example, to what's taking place with Taiwan. From the Chinese point of view, there are many components to the challenge. That is to say, it is not merely a military competition. It is not merely an economic competition. It is not merely a societal competition. It's not merely an ideological competition. It is all of those things pulled together into a single complex and meant to drive both their behavior and their decisions internally, and to define what their objectives will be externally, and thirdly, then, to send a message to the other great powers, the United States in particular, as to what the PRC's interests are, to which we are expected to defer. Right? This is a serious competition and one that the Chinese are determined to win. And so it is gratifying that the United States has slowly but surely come to the conclusion that indeed it is in a competition. Well, what has all this to do with technology transfer and innovation? We tend here to have been quite tactical, if you will, in our considerations of tech transfers. Dual use technologies. Thinking about them in particular ways as to how, from our point of view, we make a particular process better or a particular weapon system better by making use of that technology. I'd suggest that the Chinese have a much broader, deeper, higher understanding of it and look at it again, in a strategic way and ask themselves, how does dual use technology advance their competitive advantage vis-a-vis other great powers? And the best example we have is that complex of dual use technologies known as artificial intelligence. And the Chinese have gone out of their way, as they've made plain, to invest heavily in it. But it's not just to give themselves an advantage on the battlefield. It's not just to make it more possible for them to drive a particular market segment. It is not merely to underscore their investments in the underlying technologies. No, it is to build out a capability to influence via the technologies and capabilities associated with AI, perceptions of themselves by others, and to drive the competition in a strategic direction that permits them, in their judgment, to be able to anticipate how others will react prior even to the adversary quite having formed its own thoughts about how it intends to react, and thereby anticipate and preempt those moves and choices that might be made by an adversary. It is an ambitious goal. They call it intelligencization of warfare. where we should take warfare to mean competition. And they believe that they can indeed anticipate how events will unfold. Now, we might, I'll close with this, think about it as fantastical. But if you ask yourself, why is it that they are hoovering up every bit of data they can find in the world on almost any subject in the world? It has to do with training their AI systems in order to be able to provide them with confidence that it will give them the kind of anticipatory advantage that they seek. Thanks, Steve.
Well, those are perfect comments, and they tee up Kimberly very nicely as well, especially your comment about China using their economic heft is essentially a mercantilist power to drive or enforce compliance with their own view. Now, as Kimberly knows, the two things that the Chinese say they have no worldview, but in the absence of a worldview could certainly be a worldview in and of itself. And I think our friends in Africa are discovering that at this moment. It also gives rise to the, it's debatable if it was actually said by him, but the quote by Winston Churchill that you can always count on America to do the right thing only after they've exhausted all of their options. So with that, Kimberly, you were uniquely positioned from your time at XM, having literally just left, to comment on some of the great programs you've done, such as transformational exports to encourage and enable American economic power, both here and abroad. So would really enjoy hearing your perspective, especially given its recency. So please.
Thank you so very much. And I'm so pleased to be talking about America's future. As Stephen mentioned, I just finished a 10-year reopening and reauthorizing our nation's official export credit agency, or the Export-Import Bank of the United States. And I have a cooling off period, so we're going to be respectful of my comments and the guidance that I've received on that. But I just want to say that when I showed up at XM in May of 2019, I had to work with Congress to get the agency reauthorized. There are over 110, maybe about 115 export credit agencies around the world supporting their businesses and workers and trying to get the world to buy their goods and services. And so I can't think of a better job that I could ever have than supporting American goods by facilitating US exports, which is what we did at XM. And because XM, you have to do a deep dive on this, was shut for 4 years because there was not a Senate confirmed board. Guess what happened? The world changed and supply chains moved from our country to other countries because it's about the bottom line. And China became quite aggressive, as we know, furthering its agenda through the Belt and Road in China 2025 initiatives. And they use their export credit agency. So we know of 2 official export credit agencies, 1 unofficial, but they do a lot around the world. And so finally we got confirmed, and I worked with the Congress, and Congress said, XM, not only do we want you to be back, and not only are we going to give you the longest reauthorization in the history of the bank, which was started in 1934, 7-year reauth, but we also want you to focus on the reality of today and stand up a program on China and transformational exports. And so if you read the legislative language, it basically charges XM with establishing a program where they dedicate at least 20% of their total capability of financing. XM can be supporting on its book at any one time $135 billion in deals. And when I left XM, it was about 40 billion because we'd been shut for a while. And these deals can take a while. There's a lot of due diligence and underwriting and whatnot. And so we got the bank re-going, but Congress said, we want you to focus at least 20% of that $135 billion on advancing America's comparative leadership in the world and neutralizing China. And Congress gave us the ability to match the rate, terms, and other conditions that the PRC may be offering a foreign purchaser. And Congress also said, and Stephen's touched on this, they want EXIM to focus on transformational exports. And there are 10 categories that you can see on EXIM's website as part of its China program, but those include AI, 5G, quantum computing, semiconductors. I worked in the world of food and ag for many years before coming to EXIM. So biotechnology is included in topics like biomedical sciences. So Congress really wants our country to be supportive of that. So stood up a program, worked through all that you have to do, looked at the policies and procedures of EXIM to make sure that we can fulfill Congress's requirement. And that included changing a US content rule that we had at the bank for these exports, because when you think about 5G, who do we have out there doing that? Huawei, Samsung, Nokia, Ericsson, but we have American components that go into that. So we want the world choosing trusted ally and partner in American goods and services. So I'm not there now, but there's a great head of the program. His name's Adam Frost. He came over from the Department of Defense. And I know that EXIM just had their annual conference last week. And Adam, I know, spent some time online talking about these programs. And if you look at the website, I really encourage any company that wants to do good to be focused in. Before I close out, I also want to note that those companies and others engaged with Congress may want to read EXIM's annual competitiveness report that came out on June 30th of this year. And because of COVID, we see that the PRC, from what we know, again, we're talking about transparency lacking here, but we know that they did about $18 billion in official export credit financing during last year, which is during COVID. The year before, we could track 33 billion, but they still far exceed the volume of other nations. And when I was there, they were doing essentially what the G7 was doing combined. But in the competitiveness report from June 30th of this year, there's an advisory committee that was chaired by former Congressman of New Mexico, Stephen Pierce, and a great group of people, including Paula Dobriansky, Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, Deborah Wynne-Smith, CEO of the Council on Competitiveness, and other thoughtful leaders, small business to every industry you can imagine. But there are some recommendations that Congress should be reading and focusing in on, dealing with the PRC. And so Congress really should implement proper financing and resourcing of the program. But a thing that's interesting is that they are recommending that Congress consider expanding EXIM's authority to support defense articles and services and review how foreign export credit agencies support such exports. Right now, the law says EXIM can't finance those types of things except for counter narcotic exports. So I just wanted to flag that because this is the perfect audience to know that an outside committee, which is now chaired by former Senator Heidi Heitkamp, has asked Congress to think about this. So look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kimberly. And I look forward to getting more into especially EXIM's role in enabling dual use technology, especially once we someone actually defines what that means in the context of strategic competition. Dimitri, what I'm sure many of our audience members are scratching their head saying, "Hey, Department of Energy I didn't know that was a thing." Number one. Number two, what does DOE have to do with technology or certainly AI? Aren't they focused on solar panels, or assuming they know that you also handle all of our nuclear weapons? What does any of this have to do with someone listening who's into technology, commercializing technology, and offering it to the government and to the commercial sector? So you have a fascinating, just left as a fascinating role covering artificial intelligence and technology for the department. So would love to hear about that experience, as I think it's directly applicable, and especially from a decidedly non-defense centric perspective. I think would add a valuable flavor to people dialing in who maybe aren't in the Beltway or work for a large defense corporate. So over to you, sir.
Thanks. First, glad to be part of this. It's nice to be part of this nice panel. I have to preface everything with a statement that the remarks are my own. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Energy Department nor the U.S. government. And I want to offer kind of my technical point of view on a number of issues related to this. Energy Department, just as a few framing words, since you brought it up, is DOE is better thought of as Department of Everything. Instead of Department of Energy, because it has a broad number of mission requirements that most people don't appreciate. Energy is part of it, but with the nuclear weapons enterprise, historically rooted in the Manhattan Project, nuclear non-proliferation missions, intelligence functions, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve there along the Gulf Coast, owning maybe 10% of the grid, coast to coast transmission wires, environmental remediation, biggest funders of physical sciences in the US. I mean, the list goes on with the kinds of responsibilities we have, all underpinned by the need of pushing the envelope in technologies to achieve the missions that are fundamentally core to why we exist. So, historically, since the Manhattan Project, we have been delivering the world's fastest supercomputers, and we still continue to do that. And AI has become part of this as we think of where we're going next. So it's core to how we think. I wanted to say something a little narrower today. I like the way Steve and Kimberly framed this. I think I don't want to add specifically to what they said because I thought that was great. I wanted to kind of think back to you, Stephen, on your game theory roots and say a few thoughts there, because, as I think of technologies and potential dual use, I think of them in broad categories of what could be different in our options to work with them, and should we be thinking differently? And could they impact the strategic context in which they evolve? And I like to think of one particular class that interests me is what I call democratized technologies. And underpinning what those are is kind of a number of competing elements, and it's not just simply lower entry levels into the use of those technologies. While those levels continue to be lowered through commercial markets and making technologies cheaper and more capable, faster to implement, I think what's more important is the ensuing empowerment of the users to immediately create new products and platforms. This whole open innovation we're seeing global, especially in AI, the global connectivity that spreads and accelerates innovation. Effectively, anyone can participate. Empowerment is dependent on factors such as connectivity of the users, affordability, accessibility of tools, as some of these enablers. But the development of the technology platforms, such as what we see today in advanced manufacturing or robotics or AI, serve to increase accessibility, reduce costs, help draw in more fast followers and co-innovators. So in turn, the empowered actors develop surprises, limited often by creativity, which can be low cost and disruptive. And many of these technologies bring about deep questions on how to impose ethical standards, as we struggle with today, develop overarching structures on whether to push or for the development of international agreements or other instruments. A while back, I had a look at these to ask whether there is anything structurally different in the domains of and challenges of democratized technologies, or whether it's really just a more nuanced and more complicated version of the standard national security challenge we faced in the past for other classes of technologies. And I think there's also an aspect of stage setting here that's important on whether new approaches are needed for anything. So my lens has been in game theory and doing this analysis. So I bring it up because in the intro, I noticed that was brought up. And because, as you know, Stephen, it's an analytical construct that can, it's not a truth, but it allows a robust exploration of qualitative differences between traditional approaches to stability and what could be different with these kinds of democratized technologies. recall it has early roots in the Cold War in terms of game theory, where kind of the polar world and tools developed then that have been applied to, management, labor arbitration, or the NFL draft, or biological evolution, very robust. Common to all of these has been this concept of Nash equilibrium. Nash equilibrium is kind of a stable outcome where those involved in the so-called, game, the thing that you're worried about, are aware of each other's strategies and recognize that any deviation from where they currently are doesn't yield any benefits to themselves. And so you reach these stable points. The equilibria, the Nash equilibria, are specific to games, the details of a game. And over time, players converge to those. And we could say that our shared experience in the negotiation of regulatory regimes or treaties could be, has been put into context of game theory like this. So you could view stability in this sense of trying to create these structures as the mutual discovery of Nash equilibria. Now the question is, well, what if there aren't any? So in recent years, there have been stronger, more robust characterizations of humans, something called behavioral game theory that arose in the mid-2000s, which are more realistic in terms of human behavior, that capture some of the elements described, by Steve in his remarks, complex drivers and motivations, likely many players involved. They involve diverse motive strategies, doubts, mistakes, and learning that could be paced with technologies, as well as correlations in the players. And so the question is, well, okay, so if you say there is a game here and you define many players and you try and quantify how you think of democratized technologies, is there something else at play that we should reflect on? The number of actors in these games can be large. They can all have, again, distinct motivations, risks, rewards, drivers, and each can have their own motivations or strategies available to them that can change in time. And, in some analysis we did, just a couple of years ago, what you find is that in these kinds of games, there are often no Nash equilibria. When you have these kinds of complexities, as you see in emerging technologies that are democratizing, the results can be, in the physics sense, chaotic, which means you cannot predict the outcomes. You change the inputs, you change some of the restrictions, and you're not converging anywhere. You're actually going off in unpredictable, unexpected directions. It doesn't mean all is lost. In physics, going back to my background, when you identify a system as chaotic, you're happy because there are tools for that. And often in complex systems, such as the Nobel Prize being awarded this week to Giorgio Parisi in complex systems, you can extract salient features that can guide you on how to think about it. And those are different than traditional things for non-chaotic systems. So, these games, what happens in these games is that the time evolution of player strategies evolve kind of randomly in time. And so the player responses are unpredictable because there are no equilibrium. So, game theory is, an abstraction to human behavior. So it's not meant to say, well, this is a truth. But with kind of increasing refinement and validation over time, it can be useful as a tool for thinking about actions. And so the bottom line is, it's not that game theory could show you the way. Rather, it can offer clarifying insights, into the need for new approaches to the problems we face. It might be that altogether new approaches have to be considered because how we've traditionally dealt with such classes of problems in the past really might not transfer to these technologies. And we might be surprised that as we think we are changing an input or a condition or a strategy, that the responses are entirely unexpected in ways that will be hard to understand unless we appreciate the fact that that is core to what is the dynamic. So anyway, I think there are additional complexities to worry about here. And thanks for letting me talk a little bit about this. Thanks.
And we'll definitely get into those complexities too. I guess let me ask a couple questions, and I'll direct them towards one person in particular, but the rest of you feel free to pile on. Steve, a lot of what Dimitri was talking about, I think I agree with. In some ways, I'd like your point of view, because I feel like we're returning in some ways to the status quo ante, i.e. the Cold War, but maybe with more powers at the table now. Just this week or last week, China rolled out basically an exact copy of the Valkyrie, the Kratos unmanned combat aerial vehicle. Russia's unveiled their own hypersonic drone, which looks more like a demonstrator or a test bed, as they call it. But nonetheless, they're proving again and again that they do have the technological power to keep pace. Whether or not they can produce the units or not is a different story. And I guess it brings a question to my mind, which is, we're in a rush to maintain what we collectively refer to as our qualitative military edge, right? What gives us the technological superiority to extend American dominance across the globe. And that's all fine and well. A concern I have is, does this technology, this push for dual use technology, which is certainly meritorious, going back to Dimitri's commentary around game theory, does that only increase the velocity of the danger to conflict, or increase the velocity to on-ramps and hopefully off-ramps to conflict as well? Do you have any thoughts on that topic?
Broad question. So first, on going back to a Cold War arrangement, I don't share that view. I think our circumstances are fundamentally different. It is not a bipolar set of circumstances we face. And the integration of the economic side of the relationship between the US, China, Europe is much different than it was before. The Russians are still outliers, but the integration with the Chinese in a global market changes the nature of that competition first. Second, the purpose, the objective of the participants in this great power or strategic competition is to do one of two things with the circumstances or conditions that Dimitri identified. One is either to manage them to their advantage or to impose their solution. That there isn't a third option if you're going to win. Because a state of chaos and stasis or equilibrium is not advancing my objective. So then you say to yourself, from the point of view of Kim's discussion about exports, we have to trade in the market. And it is important that our position in the market, the global market, be maintained on all of those items she identified. But every one of them is supportive of the kind of objective that the Chinese or the Russians or others would want to pursue. Hence, we have to change our risk profile in thinking about who we trade with and who they trade with, and how we are going to manage that risk as time goes on. It is not stoppable. It's not in our interest to stop it, but we do have to manage it, and therefore we have to have a better sense of risk.
So, well said. Kimberly, about 2 or 3 years ago, and this is a much longer discussion, I worked on the what's now known as the Trusted Capital program inside the Department of Defense. And it was originally a brilliant idea that came out of the industrial policy shop. And frankly, it caught most of the senior Department of Defense officials flat-footed. Because the program and the idea took a life of its own. Now, this is an idea, of course, that says official U.S. policy when it comes to protecting or official U.S. policy when it comes to arms technology is protect and promote, right? We need to be protecting certain defense critical technology that comes in or that other people are trying to acquire. That gets to Steve's point about we need to know who we're trading with and who they're trading with. It also advances this idea of promotion, right? We need to promote American industries intentionally to ensure their continued long-term viability in the global marketplace. The big challenge I saw in its execution and operation was we don't really know what we're supposed to be protecting or promoting. Like there's not, people will swear up and down, oh, there's a list, there's a list. There's not a list. There's not, or at least a current list. And the global economy, even the US startup economy, moves pretty fast. And new technologies, many of which Dimitri and Steve have their hands in or are aware of, are continually rolling out or being attempted to be commercialized. So from your perspective broadly, without your current, having just departed XM shackles on, what has been your perspective, and what should the United States broadly be doing to continue to advance that protect and promote dynamic while still operating within the laws that we're trying to abide by?
Absolutely. And I at XM enjoyed having conversations with DoD. And I've really made sure that XM was plugged into the National Security Council. I actually created a position of National Security Advisor at XM that had never been done before, because you've got economic security as national security. And we have processes in place such as CFIUS. And I know that anytime XM has a deal for consideration, because applicants present their requests for financing, it goes through an interagency process and a lot of due diligence. But during my tenure in government, we really worked hard to create something called deal teams across government. And then you saw efforts such as Undersecretary of State Keith Kroc really push, and I think he's still pushing, something called the Clean Network. So we're really working with partners and allies. But I think it takes, hopefully, the Biden administration will continue that whole of government effort in really charging the great companies in our country with stepping up and making resources available, not only from XM, but whole of government. Every foreign purchaser has different needs. So it could be the International Development Finance Corporation or other programs. So I enjoyed working hard, but it takes a broad effort, and not only within government, but with the private sector. So the Council on Competitiveness, I'd like to point you as well to, they have a great report called Competing in the New Economy, and they spent many months with these CEOs, government officials, the national labs, scientists talking about this very issue. So I want to commend that to you. And then just closing it out, I'd like to hear your thoughts. We've just left Afghanistan, and President Biden said part of the rationale for leaving Afghanistan was to pivot to the Indo-Pacific region. So I was just on a Zoom call with former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, and Congressman Mike Walsh and others through something called the Nixon Seminar, where we discussed this. But I really hope that we see those resources and that treasure being invested now and pivoting to the Indo-Pacific region, because we know about this great threat and adversary there. So if you have any thoughts on that, but I hope the companies and our government is working hard on that. Thank you.
Well, this tees up, I think certainly Dimitri and maybe Steve has comments on this as well. This is a classic game theory problem. It brings to mind the what I call the kid brother syndrome, which is your kid brother can't make your life better, or your little brother can't make your life better, but he can sure as hell make your life a lot worse. So also known as spoiler theory. And the concern I have to Dimitri and to Steve as a follow-up to Kimberly's great question is it feels like increasingly the world order and the world system feels, and this is a question to you, it feels brittle. or it feels like it's getting brittler, primarily because of the velocity of new technologies, dual use or otherwise. And the added complexity of the fact that we all have a lot to lose. Like we all, I think the whole country feels like there is a concern that you certainly see it with the US middle class. You're seeing it with the Chinese middle class, where they feel like they're working harder than ever, and yet it just doesn't seem to be enough. And yet it increases, in some ways it increases it decreases a risk tolerance to a degree, but favors what, to use Dimitri's game theory analogy, it favors the attacker, right? So you think of an actual game, because in this case, it favors someone who's willing to push the boundaries because he knows, or she knows, see what I did there? She knows that the other players are risk intolerant. So they will continue to push and push and push the boundary to see what they can get away with. So would love to get your thoughts on that, as well as as we shift to kind of the last, what do we have here? Last 10 minutes or so, any prescriptions on what the heck we can do about any of this. So Dimitri, and then we'll welcome Steve and Kimberly's commentary here.
I think that's an interesting remark. Again, with my technical hat on, I would interpret brittleness as kind of a transition from the traditional view of stability we've had over decades, to a place today where we have the sense perhaps that outcomes are less predictable, based on changes that are made to the system, and that gives you a sense, well, maybe it's brittle, but on the other hand, maybe it's simply robustly chaotic in a technical sense, and that it isn't in fact brittle, but we are simply evolving in a new dynamic. Brittleness suggests something is going to break and fall apart. Whereas if it's simply a reflection of the unpredictability or less predictability of outcomes based on changes to inputs or motivations or strategies, then it doesn't break. It's simply the way it evolves, and you simply get used to that as a different status quo, without the traditional sense of equilibrium. So I don't know, because I will not assert that game theory is the predictor of human behavior, regardless of how complex the theories are. It's just that you don't have to necessarily interpret this as brittleness in a traditional sense. Again, stepping back and having some additional insights could help guide you into how to respond to this. I like the way Steve kind of mentioned the purpose of the game from the point of view of the major players is to manage to your advantage or impose your solutions. I think that's a great way. For a lot of these dual use technologies, there are also lots of other players who do things that we can't control in the same way. And there are these lower level of many different drivers that are at play that perhaps are a reflection of the brittleness that you sense. Again, it might entirely not be anything brittle.
Yeah. So Steve, I'm not sure it's brittle. People may be, the various leaders around the world may be uncertain. I think maybe to Dimitri's point, if I follow that string a bit. But let me come back to the point I was trying to make about the AI approach and the dual use capabilities. This is a problem to which AI I would think would have been invented to try to address, right? If the problem itself hadn't emerged under its own force. And so as we engage in all of the exchanges, technical, economic, political, and we think about how the Chinese, who have made a great point of employing these AI techniques to help them with this problem, we need to think about how they may be using it and what is it they may be concluding about this system. Because in the end, to this point about the game theoretic approach, you've got to persuade yourself that they are playing the same game, or you have to discover what game it is they're playing. And they may be playing a different game than we think we are playing. And therein, hangs a tail, right? So as we look at the way they take the innovations and technologies and the dual use capabilities and begin applying them to the solution to this complex problem that Dimitri has identified, and the complexities associated with international trade that Kim has touched on, we've got to be conscious of how they're doing it and what capability they're using and what techniques they're using, and figure out whether we have some parallel capability that we need to put in place.
Well, and it's a great tie into two questions I'm looking at here from Clay and Christian. And there's a similar vein between both of them. And it's around this concept of what you might call democratized technology, to include artificial intelligence. And again, for the uninitiated, there's really 3 levels of AI, right? 99% of all AI anyone refers to is what's called weak or narrow AI. This is an AI where it could be a great algorithm, but you still have to kind of point it where to go. Just like Google is a fantastic search engine, but you still have to type in what you want it to look for. It's not going to, through serendipity, bring you results without asking it. Then you have artificial general intelligence, or AGI. And then, of course, you have super intelligence. And that's when you get the Terminators. And I would argue we have no problems at that point. So the question then is, regardless of how sexy the new technology over the horizon, whether it's dual use or not, is, how do we as a government enterprise, as well, and I'll tie in our at least our NATO allies, how do we get our arms around or build a framework around capturing and channeling that technology, whether it comes from university professors that Steve is working with, government scientists that Dimitri knows, or certainly American businesses that Kimberly was trying to promote? How do we channel all that action and all that, say, especially certain technologies that have an edge to them and could be more lethal in nature, even software? How do we channel that towards our own purposes and our own goals, strategic competition or otherwise? And that's a question for anyone on the panel.
Stephen, you and I previously talked about the Valley of Death, and we had a great gentleman from AFWorks focusing in on the investment our government needs to be doing during this crucial time where technology is being developed. And we need to be doing more of that, I think, collectively.
So, Steve, I think from my point of view, the premise of your question is praiseworthy. The likelihood of being able to channel in the way that you're talking about is near impossible. And I suspect, generally speaking, we don't want to do that in the way that notion would be thought of. Rather, I think to where Kim was going, the government, where I'm not government anymore, the government and its various bodies need to be attentive to what it is we want to accomplish with technology going forward, and begin to focus our attention more on assuring that we are accelerating that development, that we are bringing it in ways that allow us to rapidly assess its utility to us, and thirdly, judge the risk it poses to us by being available in the wild, right? So it's from my point of view not less a matter of trying to control, manage, or direct technology development than being attentive to what it is we think we want, and being certain that we're focused on bringing that capability into our orbit, and then assessing its implications for our interests more broadly.
Maybe also just add a couple of words. I have a slightly different view of AI, and I view it in a historical context. If you look at the evolution of science, over the last 500 years or so. I view AI today analogous perhaps to the steam engine. There was a moment in time where a technology emerged that people didn't understand scientifically for almost 100 years. And from the 1600s through the 1700s, people developed the steam engine, which helped with industrialization. Again, there was no scientific basis. It was a lot of tinkering, as we see today in the market. The goal today for people, I would argue, my point of view is that it's not about AI. I don't think people actually care about AI. We're looking for ways to achieve beyond ourselves, to make things better in ways that we can't do by ourselves. And we look to whatever is available. And AI today, in its narrow definition, is providing that. But if you come up with something different tomorrow, people will go to that, because it's not about AI. As the steam engine was ultimately replaced, because it wasn't about the steam engine, it was about industrialization. And I would say AI as well is the tool today, but it's not about AI. And I think one of the one of the things we could be doing is trying to keep our eye on the long ball. The commercial markets, everyone is driven by a $40 trillion market, according to Credit Suisse recently, which is enough to pull everybody into near-term solutions for things. But there is a longer game here in the emergence of these kinds of technologies that are enablers and enhancements to human capabilities that I think will go beyond this. And I think looking at this long game could help us not get caught up in the churn that is keeping everyone awake these days. Anyway, different perspective.
Kimberly, any closing comments before we wrap up?
Greetings from Marietta, Ohio, the birthplace of the Northwest Territory, 1788. I'm here dealing with my grandparents' beautiful home to put it on the market. But I want to just be sure that we look at history, and just getting to Dimitri's point, the settlers who came here, David McCall has done a great book called Pioneers. Let's read that history and have it inspire us for what is possible for our country for the future. Thank you.
Well, it's not been the purpose of the panel to talk about technology specifically. I do think as a closing addendum, it's important to remember when we think about strategic competition, great power competition, whatever term of our government decides to use regarding threats, external threats to the country. I think it's important to think about the valleys of death that Kimberly talked about. And I know we're going to have many people from AFWorks, SoftWorks, Army Applications Lab, and Naval X, and nearly everyone else. It's important to remember that with dual use also means you actually get dual valleys of death as well that you have to cross. The commercial valley of death, which means you have to hit a sufficient number of users for your product. And of course, the government valley of death, which I've seen some people commenting on in the chat, which is really about getting a program of record, getting up, climbing the TRL chain, technology readiness level chain as fast as possible, and hope that your product sees the light of day. I think the rest of today's panel is going to get into a lot more of that goodness and a lot of those much more tactical kind of technology questions. And I know a lot of you are looking forward to, but I really appreciate Steve, Kimberly, and Dimitri joining me to set the context for what we're all talking about to begin with. And again, it's not just China, it's not just competition, it's a multi-sided challenge, or as Dimitri might say, multi-sided die that we have to roll on a daily basis and try to make the best possible choices, or at least as people in DC would know, the choose the least bad option. So with that, I'll turn it back over to David for any closing remarks and to introduce the next panel.
That's great. Thanks, Stephen. Much appreciated. Scott Murray here with David Hamilton. We appreciate you and your incredible trio of guests. Everybody had such great information. It's really very special. You never know what to expect, and you go, oh gosh, I never thought of that. So America's Feature Series is what you're a part of on this Thursday, the National Security Dual Use Technology Summit. As we continue on, my name is Scott Murray, and alongside is the founder and the CEO of the America's Future Series, David Hamilton. What'd you think? That's you know, you never know what to expect, David, and then you go, gee, I never thought of that.
Well, this was fantastic because it did frame sort of the discussion for the entire day.
Right.
Right. And secondly, I'm very interested in that house in the Northwest Territory. So I really would like the listing. So my wife wants to move there. Okay. So
All
that was
right.
two great things, right? So this framed the discussion very well. It does tee us up for, I think, for a great day. You know, I love the fact that they're talking about thinking about things differently. You know, AI is the thing du jour, but you know, we
Right,
really care
right,
about the outcome,
right.
the purpose. And they talk about the value of death, all these things that we're going to talk about, et cetera. And I think it framed the discussion. And ultimately, I love having those kinds of people together on a call together, et cetera. And the purpose that we're trying to do is have people talk, et cetera. And I'm hoping that they, you know, that they know each other and that some of them know each other, they know
Absolutely.
others, but good things will come from that.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting because I, you know, one of those guys that's not a techie of sorts, just to kind of stand back and go, okay, what are they going to talk about now? And then I go, gosh, you know, it's just fascinating.
Yes,
You
sir.
never know.